Hey, this is Ryan Jones from Serverless Guru. I wanted to record a video talking about another template that we have here at Serverless Guru. As you know, we work with a lot of clients, and as we work with clients, we develop internal material that we use to better sharpen our tool set as we're building out these serverless applications. This is another one here, so we're going to get into that in this video. If you haven't already, drop a like, drop a subscribe if this is useful to you. If you got value out of this video, go ahead and do that because we're going to be rolling out new content potentially every couple of days, every at least a few times a week. And if you like it and it's interesting and you have any feedback for us, the best way to get in touch with us is drop a comment on the YouTube video or hit us up on Twitter at Serverless Guru. So, getting into this video, we're going to be talking about CI/CD pipelines. So the big thing with this video is we're going to jump into a README that we have. You can also find this at the Serverless Guru GitHub, and you can go to the templates repository and then go to /CICD. What we have here is some high-level information here about what this actually does. We'll talk about that real quick. So the flow of this is that you're going to deploy the CI/CD stack with an AWS IAM user and an AWS IAM role. Then you're going to create an access key and secret access key for the AWS IAM user in the AWS console. What this does is you're now going to have an AWS IAM user which has access to deploy things into your AWS account, and with that you can then deploy your CloudFormation, your AWS SAM, or your Serverless Framework, or your architect. It doesn't matter which framework you're using, they all require some level of AWS credentials, and with this you will be able to make those deployments, hook it up to your CI/CD pipeline, and go from there. Then you're going to copy that access key and that secret access key for that AWS IAM user to the CI/CD as a repository variable or environment variable. If you're working with GitHub Actions or Bitbucket pipelines, let's use those two as the baseline example. There's going to be Bitbucket pipelines has repository variables where you can drop in that access key and that secret access key, and GitHub Actions has something similar called GitHub Action Secrets, I believe. And then you're going to configure the bash script, which already exists, to use the CI/CD AWS IAM user access key and secret access key to assume the AWS IAM role with deployment permissions. And so the setup here is that we have an IAM user that has an access key and secret access key, and then we have an IAM role. Okay, so the user is then going to assume the IAM role. And how that's going to happen is that there's a bash script that's going to run when the CI/CD kicks off. It's going to then use the credentials from the IAM user to then assume the IAM role, and then you can make your deployment of your Lambda function, your database, your SNS topic, all these different things. So for the deployment, you can create a .env file with the deploy credentials. So we have something called example.env. You can also do a bash script deployment. So you can say bash./scripts deploy.bash, pass a stage. So typically, stages might be, dev, test, prod, QA, pre-prod staging, whatever you want to call that. That's the stage that you're going to add here. Typically, when we build infrastructure as code and we follow best practices, all of our naming conventions for those resources should be stage appended. So they should all have the stage worked into the actual resource name, and that's going to allow it to be dynamic. A lot of companies, if they're following the exact best practices, they're going to have separate AWS accounts per stack. So dev, test, QA, pre-prod, staging, production, all those are going to be separate AWS accounts. Typically, pre-prod, staging is kind of the same thing, but regardless of what your company actually calls it, those stages are sometimes deployed into separate AWS accounts. At least that would be the best practice. If your company is much smaller, you're a startup, you're just getting started, you may have dev, test, and prod being deployed into the exact same AWS account, and it becomes even more important to make sure that the stage is there to change the resource names. Otherwise, you'll run into conflicts. So that's not related to the CI/CD part of this video, but it's kind of a note that I wanted to add on there. And then region is going to be important because this is what tells AWS, whether it's a CLI or SAM or the Serverless Framework, typically, where do you want this to be deployed? Do you want your DynamoDB table in US West 2 over here on the West Coast, or do you want it in US East 1 over on the East Coast? Do you want it in Europe? Where do you want this code to be deployed and resources to be deployed? Typically, you're going to want to deploy it near your end users, but of course, there's ways that you can actually get around that by deploying it into multiple regions and or using some of the global features by AWS to make sure that if you have a global user base, you're taking advantage of that. And then the deploy path, this one is the interesting one. So deploy path is the path to your serverless.yaml file. Specifically, this script works around the serverless framework. However, if you are working with AWS SAM or you are working with Architect or something else, you should be able to modify the code slightly, take out the serverless framework commands, swap in the other infrastructure as code commands, whether it's Terraform, whatever it is. Most of the time, as I said, they're going to be using a profile that links to the AWS IAM user credentials. And that's going to be the same for pretty much every infrastructure as code framework. And they're all going to do that in maybe a slightly different way. But ultimately, they're going to have a command that allows you to connect that inside of your CI/CD pipeline. And as long as you have the 80% of the script, you can swap out the 20% specific to your infrastructure as code framework. And then from there, you can make deployments. And the same thing, we have a remove.bash script down here. It's going to have the same arguments, stage, region, and deploy path. It's the exact same arguments as the deploy command. The reason why we have a remove bash script as well is because, of course, if we make a mistake, if something went wrong in our deployment and we want to actually remove the entire stack, all we have to do is say, let's say deploy stage as dev, region is US West 2, deploy path is .. We only have one serverless YAML. We're saying it's the root path, so it's .. And then we want to remove that, so we say remove.bash dev US West 2 .. and it's going to remove that. After deployment, you can create an access key and secret access key for the AWS IAM user in the AWS console, copy the access key and secret access key to Bibok pipeline repository variables as we talked about, or your chosen CI/CD in the environment variable section. These credentials are what powers the CI/CD pipeline. Okay. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and jump into something and look at it. The first thing we're going to look at here is the example.env file. The thing that we can see here is we've got a dev CI/CD role ARN, a dev CI/CD user access key, and dev CI/CD user AWS secret access key. As we said before, the AWS IAM user, these credentials here are going to be assumed, are assumed inside of the build script initially, and then used to assume the IAM role. So the only permissions that this user has is to assume this role. And so by itself, it has no permissions to your account, but with the combination of the user, access key, secret key, plus the role ARN, then we can actually deploy things into the AWS account. Sounds complex, but we actually have a template that's included, which should create this, and let's go ahead and take a look at that. So the first thing that we can see here is we have the CI/CD user here on line 21 down to 35, and you can see that it has the permissions to do STS assume role. It does have a star permission here, which can be cleaned up, of course. The CI/CD role here, this one is going to be more specific. So you can see here that we're saying the statement, principal, AWS, and we're using a function join here. And we're saying this AWS account ID and the specific IAM user that we just defined right here, the CI/CD user. So now we're at the role stage, so we're saying this role can be assumed by this user. And so that's what line 53 is here, saying user and then self-custom.aws IAM user name. If you're confused by this syntax here, what I would recommend is you to check out the 0 to paid professional course on the Serverless Guru training site. You can go to academy.serverlessguru.com or training.serverlessguru.com. We have a free course with 94 different courses on there. You can watch them, go through them. There's going to be a section called Dynamic Variables, working with the Serverless Framework. I originally made that course about a year ago, so it is sort of out of date, but there will be updates, coming in the future. And on top of that, the actual syntax around Serverless Framework hasn't changed. So there are things around the AWS ecosystem. The AWS console's changed in that time, but when you're looking at those videos, the core concepts should be the same. Next, we have a CI/CD role policy here. So the role policy is interesting. With the Serverless Framework, what we're doing is we're giving it admin permissions. Of course, in an ideal world, this is scoped down, not allowing admin permissions. We don't have that in this pattern. However, that's not to say that it is best practice. Ideally, the way that you should set this up is that you have the limited permissions here to follow least privilege. The problem becomes is that you have to really take a kind of a comb and go through each individual permission that CloudFormation needs under the hood to then run, and specifically the Serverless Framework. People have tried, people have done it. It's not impossible. However, it's not included in this pattern, so it's something to flag. And one extra thing here is that we do have the ability to add deny statements. So this is really critical because we are giving admin permission. However, we're saying that this role cannot be assumed to read items or delete items or update items from DynamoDB. So you can add additional restrictions to this role and modify it for your company use. And how that would look is that I might say, hey, you know what? S3 get item, I don't want that to happen, right? Maybe that's needed by serverless framework, and so you may hit issues there. But let's say it's something like delete RDS or something, or however you want to end up modifying this for your use case. The one that was the most obvious for me is that I don't need the deployment role to have access to delete or update DynamoDB items and data. And so there's probably different use cases like that you can identify and say, you know what, this CloudFormation role should create S3 but shouldn't be able to read files from S3. And that's how you could scope this down. At the very bottom, we've got the outputs here with the CI/CD role ARN. What you'll see is that we are not printing out the CI/CD access key and the secret key. We did this before when we were testing. However, to follow security best practices, sometimes you have to do things manually, and that's kind of where the rubber meets the road, as the saying goes. What we want to do is we want to create an environment where the automation is extremely high, and we can hit something like 100% automation. The problem in reality is that if we expose this access key and a secret access key that has admin permissions, if you assume it from that AWS IAM user, if that happens, we're exposing that in the AWS console, and it relies on our organization having enough clarity and understanding of that to not give read access to anybody for CloudFormation outputs. And of course, that's very restrictive. And so the reason why we chose not to do this is because the client we were working with, we didn't have enough confidence that they would actually follow that, and it was kind of restrictive for them to follow it in the first place. And so instead, what we're doing is we're not exposing that secret access key and that access key to the CloudFormation outputs. And instead, what we're doing is we're allowing the DevOps professionals that work with that client to then go to the AWS console, create an access key and secret key manually, and then copy that into the Bitbucket pipeline repository variables or the GitHub action secrets. That's the overview of the stack. You can see here it's 93 lines. There's some comments in here that add a couple lines. Really, this is like a 50-line stack. We could easily take out the CI/CD user key here since we don't need it anymore, and it gets much smaller from there. So this is a way for you to be able to create the IAM user and the IAM role. The user assumes the role. You can then make a deployment. This is what creates that. It's about 50 to 90 lines of YAML code here. All right, so moving forward on that, let's go back to the root. Now what we're going to do is we're going to actually look at the bash scripts here. You can see here we have two scripts here, deploy.bash and remove.bash. Let's go ahead and start with deploy.bash. They're going to be very similar. You can see up here that we have the shebang, we got the bin bash at the top. We have the assume role. This is just some documentation that you can look into about how this works. We've got some default variables being set here. You can see that they're being set with X's as well as just a sample string here. We'll get into why we're setting this as one variable in just a second, but it's critical as we get further down. You can see the arguments that were passed into the bash script. If you remember before, we passed a stage, a region, and a deploy path, 1, 2, 3. You can see that on 9, 10, and 11. $1, that's the stage. $2, that's a region. $3, that's a deploy path. Moving down further, you can see that if stage is not included, then say missing stage arg. And so what this means, and you can see this is repeated for region and deploy path, it's basically just a check. We're saying if somebody runs the bash script and they forget to pass an argument, it's just going to error out and it's not going to try to make a deployment. And that's what we want. Down here on line 32, you can see that we're doing a source.env. And what might be going through your head is, hey, Ryan, you're talking about a CI/CD pipeline. Why would we have a .env? We're not going to submit that to GitHub or Bitbucket. It's going to be in our .gitignore. So how is our CI/CD pipeline going to be able to have a .env when we're not including it in the repository? And that's a great question. So thank you for asking. What this means is that if you are able to make a deployment locally to an account, let's say it's a dev account or sandbox account, and you want your developers to be able to do that to a single account, maybe not production, then what you can do is you can create a .env locally, and that's where that .env example came from earlier. And then when this script actually runs locally, it will pull in instead of using Bitbucket repository variables or GitHub action secrets inside of a formal CI/CD pipeline, it'll actually pull it from that local file instead of pulling it from the CI/CD provider. And then it will allow you to make deployments locally to the AWS account. And it does that through, first off, setting the access key and secret key for the IAM user using your .env, and then using that access key and secret key to then assume the deployment role locally to then make the deployment to AWS. Moving on down, we have line 34 through 52. The first thing that we want to cover here is this stage check. So before we talked about dev, staging, prod as being our deployment stages, and that's for naming conventions. That's for making sure that if we do deploy to the same AWS account, they don't overlap. Well, what we talked about is that we want to, in best practices, we want to make sure that we're deploying to separate AWS accounts. So dev, staging, and prod are all 3 separate AWS accounts, okay? And with that, they're all going to have a different IAM user in each individual account, right? So the dev account has to have an IAM user and a deployment role. Staging has to have an IAM user and a deployment role, and prod, same thing. Then what we do is we go into the repository variables, and we're going to create a couple of arguments here inside of the GitHub secrets or the Bitbucket repository variables. The first one is dev _ CI/CD role ARN, and the second is dev CI/CD user AWS access key, and the third is dev _ CI/CD user AWS secret access key. These 3 variables, if the stage pass is dev, so if someone runs deploy.bash dev for the stage, it's going to look up inside of the repository variables or the GitHub actions for this value, or your .env if it's local. And then if it finds it, then it's going to set that as those default values that we set at the very top here. So CI/CD role ARN, CI/CD user access key, and user secret access key, all 3 of those get set with this dev prepended on CI/CD role ARN. And you can see, if you move down, you can see the exact same logic is repeated for each one of these stages. So hopefully by this point, it's starting to make sense how this works, is that if we expanded on that .env we looked at earlier, what you'll see here is that we would have not only dev _, but we'd have test _, staging _, prod _, and each one of these values would represent the environment. All right, so going back to the deploy.bash here. So now we've got our access key, secret access key set, and the role ARN set for the specific AWS account. If you want to add additional AWS accounts, you just have to add an else if here and change the stage to whatever your stage is called. And then change this prod _ to whatever your stage is called. It could be test, so it'll be TEST _ CI/CD role ARN, TEST CI/CD user AWS access key, and so on. And then moving to line 51 and 52, this is where we're exporting the AWS access key ID and secret access key. And then on line 54, we're assuming the CI/CD role ARN, and we're doing this using AWS access key and secret access key. When we use this syntax, naturally the AWS CLI is going to look up AWS access key ID and AWS secret access key in the terminal. And if it finds those, it's going to use those credentials to try to run this command. And so because we set it on line 51, 52, and then on line 54, we ran the assume role command, passing a role ARN, it's now going to work. With this, it's going to send back something that looks like this. So you can see in here we have credentials, access key ID, secret access key, session token, expiration, so on. Now moving down to line 71 through 73, we're using something called JQ. JQ is a way for you to actually take JSON that's being returned from a command and actually loop over it and grab certain values. And so in this case, we don't have to do a loop. It's only returning back one JSON object. But what we're doing here is .credentials. So we're saying go to the object, go to the credentials key, and then go into that credentials object and grab the access key ID. And that pulls back this value here. And then on the next command, we're saying go to credentials, which is here, and then .secret access key, and then grab this value here. And repeat that again, credentials, and then session token, and then grab this value here. And we keep doing that until we have all 3 of these variables set. So this is assumed AWS access key ID, assumed AWS access secret key, and assumed AWS session token. Why are we doing that? We're doing that because we just assumed the AWS IAM role, which is our deployment role, and it returns back its own temporary set of credentials for access key, secret key, and session token. And those three things are what we're going to set now inside of our local environment, whether it's on the CI/CD pipeline or whether it's our local terminal. We're going to set those, and then we're going to be able to make a deployment. 75 through 77, you can see that we do just that. You're going to notice that 75 and 76 look identical to 51 and 52. 51 and 52, we set the AWS access key ID and secret access key for the AWS IAM user. And then on 75 and 77, we set the assumed deployment role access key and secret access key, which will expire at some point. And you can modify the expiration date. Now on line 79, this is where the actual serverless framework part comes in. All the rest of that was just set up. So we got one line of serverless framework command code here, and that's going to say SLS deploy -- stage $stage. So the same stage that we're using to determine what credentials to pass in for our AWS IAM user and deployment role is the same stage that we're passing into the actual serverless framework deploy command. And for -- region, it's the same thing. We're passing in $region. That's coming from the actual deploy.bash command as well as the second argument. And the third argument, that deploy path, which we talked about, which is probably confusing a little bit, it's basically saying where is the serverless.yaml file that we want to actually use to then make a deployment. And that's right here, cd $deploy path. And so if the deploy path was /, then it would go cd into / and then SLS deploy. If it was inside of a subdirectory, we might say the deploy path is deploy.bash dev uswest2, and then our deploy path would be services/account/. And now what it's going to do is it's going to cd into services and then cd into account inside of services, and then it's going to run SLS deploy, because maybe we have our repository structure broken out by services so that each service has its own serverless.yaml file. That's best practice for a lot of reasons, the biggest one being isolation of resources. So when you're building these services out and it becomes 25 different Lambda functions that you're deploying, or 25 different groupings of Lambda functions, so that would be like account, billing, feed, things like that. When you have something like that, each one of those, account might be CRUD functionality, so it might be 5 different Lambdas. Billing might be CRUD functionality, it's 5 different Lambdas. The feed might be 5 different functionalities for sending emails or following up with people, whatever that looks like. Each one of those would be separate Lambda functions, and you don't really want those to be all inside of one serverless.yaml file or inside of one infrastructure as code stack, because what ends up happening is that if there's problems with one resource, it ends up causing cascading problems for all the other resources, strictly because it's a blocking operation, right? Because everything is defined in one stack, you can only deploy that one stack at once. And so if anything breaks inside of that stack, you block the other things from happening. And if you have multiple people working on the team that all need to make updates, that quickly becomes a problem. So ideally, you have each section of functionality broken out into a separate infrastructure as code stack. That would be how we would build it. Even if it was using AWS SAM instead of Serverless Framework, it would be the exact same. All right, remove.bash. You're going to be pleasantly relieved that I'm not going to go through line by line on this one. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you can see that it's the exact same as the deploy.bash. The only difference is that on line 79 it says SLS remove instead of SLS deploy, and that's it. So with that is an overview of the CI/CD template that we've created based on our experience working with clients. And ideally, this can be looped into any GitHub Actions, Bitbucket pipelines, code build potentially as well, although code build's a little bit better because you can assume your own AWS IAM role and you don't really need to pass around credentials. But regardless, whatever you're using, if it's working with AWS and you're having to build some type of script and you may not know how all the different things are going to work out with the arguments to actually deploy this stuff, and how that would actually look like, this is a way for you to jumpstart pretty far ahead, because you can take this serverless.yaml file here, You can pause the video now, you can look at it, and you can actually reuse this functionality for your own purposes. And with that, you're going to be able to jumpstart the CSE process at your company and or streamline it so that it's just a little bit better. And of course, if you have questions, Serverless Guru is a consulting company. We do help clients with this. That is what this is from. And with that, we're giving back to the community here. We're helping other people be able to level up their serverless game. And if your company needs to take it a little bit more serious, and you need help adopting that, then go to serverlessguru.com. We have a sales form there. You can fill it out. You can let us know a little bit more information about your company, how we might be able to help. And then, of course, send us any information that you have. We'll get that process started. And in the meantime, drop a like, drop a subscribe, and let us know in the comments or on Twitter at Serverless Guru if you want to see any other content around videos. And we're planning to keep rolling these out at least once a week or a couple times a week. And we thank you for your viewership. Thanks.